Kim. I'm 37 years old. I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I'm shunned.
All right, Kim. So how'd you get to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses in the first place? Is it something you were born into?
My parents actually came into the religion when my brother and I were infants. We've known, that's all we knew since the time we could, remember anything. They were first generation Jehovah's Witnesses. The rest of their family, nobody else joined. My grandparents were like Southern Baptists, and my dad's parents didn't have any religion at all. But when they came into the religion, both of my parents decided to shun the rest of their family also. So I didn't know any other religion but Jehovah's Witnesses.
I think that's a really good point that you bring up about shunning the rest of the family. From day one, you're taught to isolate yourself from other people. And so shunning is in the blood of Jehovah's Witnesses. It's in the DNA. From the moment you start learning about it and cutting people off in your life, shunning is present in some way, shape, or form. And then obviously we do it on the back end as well when people would leave. So that's a really good point that you bring up. And your family, do you have any idea why your parents got interested in it?
Yeah, they told us one time it was having kids. They wanted to bring up their kids in a good, religious environment and give us good morals and values and whatnot. I think that's pretty common for a lot of parents. But it didn't really turn out that way.
Yeah, absolutely. That is very common. A lot of times it's around the time someone has a child, they're feeling vulnerable, they've got this new little kid and they want to raise it right, whatever they define that is as, and it helps to have a system to jump into at times as a parent to help that along. So what was the worldview that you were given in being raised? I mean, it sounds like you were really small, so it's probably all you ever knew. What was the worldview that you had being raised one of Jehovah's Witnesses?
My parents were very extreme Jehovah's Witnesses. We were taught that the world is evil, that we're not to trust anybody in the world. We're not to trust authority, not to trust teachers. It created a very scared worldview. My brother and I both, we grew up very terrified of the outside world.
How close in age were you and your brother?
We're only 10 months apart.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, do the math.
yeah, that's pretty easy to figure out there. Okay. So I imagine you all did have very similar experiences then, at least at that point in life. Being taught not to trust people, what was your life like when you went to school? Were you terrified of that thought and the people around you, or how did that work for you?
Oh, absolutely. I didn't have any friends. I was afraid to talk to anybody who was in my class. I was afraid of my teachers. I was afraid of the principal. Very early on, I learned to kind of make myself a bit of a martyr, as Jehovah's Witnesses ask their children to do a lot with, not being able to participate in school events or holidays or pep rallies or any of that stuff. So that wasn't fun, but it earned me a lot of praise at home. So I definitely made sure to set myself apart from the world, as they like to say. And I did it in very deliberate, obvious ways. So of course I didn't have any friends.
Yeah, of course. So you said that you were afraid of your teachers. Teachers, when a kid goes to school, a lot of times, they have implicit trust in their teacher because that's the adult in the room, right? So for you, what were you afraid of? What do you think that teacher was going to do? And just, what was the fear surrounding that?
Well, I grew up in an extremely abusive household, which it was difficult to hide bruises and stuff. But I was afraid that if I got too close to anybody, or if I let my teachers see the bruises or talk to me about my home life or anything, that they would take me away, because I was told that by my parents that if anybody ever found out about what was happening at home, then I would go into foster care. and they would tell me horror stories about what foster care was supposed to be like. And so that instilled a deep sense of fear to any authority figure. I didn't want to talk to any authority figure about that.
Okay. So your fear, did you also, so the typical JW fear is, the fear that these teachers or the other students are going to corrupt them somehow and take them away from Jehovah, and then they're going to, lose their salvation and everything, or upset Jehovah, or usually their parents. So it sounds like for you, it was more the cover up and the hiding of the abuse you were going through as a child.
Yeah, and the other stuff came later as I got older. I only went to school through 4th grade, and then my parents pulled me out and homeschooled both of us. But yeah, definitely as I got older, I can remember around age 9 or 10, starting to become distrustful of worldly influences because I didn't want to lose my faith. But, when I was younger, it was mostly just fear of being found out, being taken away from my family.
Okay. All right. Because I know sometimes even small kids are just terrified of, upsetting Jehovah or whatever, because they've been given these rules that they have to follow. That's interesting. So then that kind of cuts to your home life. What was life like growing up at home from you? I mean, you mentioned the abuse. Was that centered around, I've talked to a lot of people who, they got beat every time after the meeting because they didn't do something right or whatever. What was your home life like? What was the atmosphere growing up for you?
We were supposed to be seen and not heard. We were not allowed to act like children, especially at meetings. Like there were times if we gave a wrong answer or they didn't like the way we were behaving or we were talking to each other or something, my dad would take us out and have us cut down a switch and beat us in front of the Kingdom Hall. And that was a very common practice. Everybody, everybody just looked the other way because there's the scripture, spare the rod, spoil the child. And they very much believed in that literally. So any infraction would result in a beating from my dad. And my mom was just kind of checked out a little bit. So she just kind of let it happen. But my whole life growing up was just lived in terror. It was just fear. And I didn't know anything else but fear until I was out of the church, really, until I was in my early 20s.
Yeah. Obviously Jehovah's Witnesses, the cult, is very fear based. We talk about the fog cult model, fear, obligation, and guilt, and how those things are used against people to keep them in. Your dad taking you out and beating you at the switch in front of the Kingdom Hall. That's terrible. I'm sorry that happened. It's emblematic though of there were a lot of kids. I just remember at the congregation I grew up, you'd see a kid be taken out by a parent and the kid's screaming and everybody knows what's about to happen. But people kind of laughed about it and they chuckle like it was funny, oh, ha, 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 little Johnny is getting taken out. Listen to him scream. It was this weird, abusive environment where people, I guess they probably thought the means justified the ends, that beating your child, I guess if it saved their life because they stayed in the truth and attained salvation, then it was okay. But it was just horribly abusive. I saw it with certain parents in the congregation that I grew up in too. And it's just awful.
It was literally the most important thing for them, not their children's health and well-being or psychological development or anything like that. The most important thing was that they stay in the truth, and if they had to beat that into them, that's what they were going to do. And yeah, everybody just looks the other way. It's such a common practice that nobody thinks anything about it.
They have the song now, I believe, in their songbook called I just remember it because I think it was near the time when we were leaving. They had just come out with the new songbook for a short period of time. And I just remember, I think one of the first songs we sang out of it was called Listen, Obey, and Be Blessed. And, and I was just like, Wow. I mean, they're just telling you right there. It's a cult. They're just telling you, like, just do what we say, and good things will happen. And if you don't, then obviously the opposite happens, right? Uh,
Yeah.
and that's just kind of the environment.
So you're relatively newish out of the cults, because I left when I was 20. So I don't know any of the new stuff, like the new Kingdom melodies, and I just recently learned about the propaganda cartoons and watched them and got all furious, as you do. But they didn't have any of that stuff back then.
Yeah. So you, yeah. So, well, you didn't miss much, not much of value anyway. And yeah, I mean, they're just ever evolving in their ways of manipulating people, essentially. And now with the kids and the cartoons, it's terrible. Very, very terrible. Well, so your mom's kind of checked out. Your dad is pretty physically abusive. Um, did you find, obviously at the meetings you were in danger of getting beat, but did you find anything at the meetings? Did you you couldn't have friends at school. Did you at least maybe have some friends or anything going on at the Kingdom Hall that you were into?
It's unfortunate that none of the Kingdom Halls we were ever part of had very many children. And that seemed to be an acceptable thing for my parents, that my brother and I grew up without very many friends. So, I mean, I had my brother, which I'm really grateful for. We fought a lot as children, but we're very good friends now. And if I hadn't had him growing up, I don't know how I would have made it. But no, I didn't look forward to anything about the meetings at all. There were times that I would throw a tantrum and refuse to go, and my parents would threaten to take me in my pajamas, I hated going to the meetings. I hated sitting there. I hated answering the questions. But yeah, there was no redeeming quality of going to the meetings. I didn't even get to see friends or do anything fun. And, even when there were fun things, like some of the brothers and sisters would organize potlucks or football games or whatever, we weren't allowed to participate. They wanted us isolated.
Wow. Okay. So you were even isolated. So even your parents weren't doing anything inside the organization with other families.
No.
Wow.
I mean, they did the bare minimum that they had to do. My dad had aspirations of being an elder. He was a ministerial servant for a number of years. But then his privileges got taken away when I became a teenager, and I became a little less easy to control.
Gotcha.
So,
okay, we'll get to that in a minute. I'm sure. So with that being the case, what about when you all went out in field service? Did you all always work together as a family, or did you ever get to work with anybody else? Because I mean, they sound so isolating. I'm just kind of wondering, even in the congregation, doing witnessy activities, were you isolated there too?
That was the only time that I wasn't. And that's when I really started to get into the idea that I wanted to be a pioneer, because it was my escape, I guess. I got to get out. I got to be with the brothers and sisters. I got to talk to new people. Even if they were worldly, I wasn't afraid of them because I had, my book bag, and I had all my literature, and I had prepared statements to read to them. And I knew that I was going to be okay out there with my, brothers and sisters in field service. But that was the only time we were really allowed to be around other people.
And I noticed that you also said that you might throw a fit about going to the meeting and they would threaten to pull you out in your pajamas, and take you to the meeting. I'm just wondering, because you've mentioned the abuse, was it worse around witness activities? In other words, were you also afraid of going to the meeting because you knew you were kind of in a losing scenario there, where inevitably you were going to do something that was going to result in the abuse, but maybe if you stayed home, it might not have been quite as bad?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if the organization and the association with it exacerbated the abuse.
Oh, it absolutely did. Yeah, it absolutely did. Because I knew if I went to the meeting and I did something wrong, their behavior toward me was condoned. It was applauded. You're being a good father if you take them out front and beat them, So I was scared of meetings for a long time because of that. And that was mostly when I was a younger child. But, as I got older, that subsided a lot.
Just wonder what's an example of what did you do wrong? What was so awful that you did that had to result in this kind of behavior?
One time I remember I was like coloring with a highlighter in the Watchtower magazine when I should have been paying attention. It was things like that, or talking to somebody, like fighting with my brother or talking to him during the meetings, things that small children do. And I'm talking, I was a small child, like under like 8 years old.
Yeah. How many adults today have a hard time sitting down for 2 hours in a boring meeting? I mean, to expect children to sit there for hours on end as someone babbles on about something from the platform that a child's not even going to understand, that they're not going to grasp the magnitude of what's going on there to a great degree at times. It's crazy to think that you're going to have children just sit and do this, but they make it happen one way or another, unfortunately. I'm sorry that the meetings ended up, I mean, my wife grew up in a congregation too where there were no young people, and it's tough. You don't have any peers to have as friends, and you're expected to just make friends with all the older ones in the Kingdom Hall. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but kids need peers as well. So to this day, I still make friends with older people better. But yeah, you're right. I did have to make friends with the older people in the congregation. And that was, not necessarily a bad thing. There were some really good people who were in the church. Unfortunately, they have never, gotten out, but I still think that some people in are good people. And I do miss their friendship. And that's kind of one of the hardest parts about being shunned is you don't have those lifelong friendships. You can't just call them up anymore, because they will just treat you like you don't exist. Oh yeah. One of the problems with leaving, however you exit, is that your roots are cut off. Your roots of life, everything that was the beginnings, you lose all of that. It's like a part of you didn't exist. And it's the stuff that a lot of people look back on fondly or connect to, the people who were their roots, whether it's family or friends at school or whatever growing up. Because we're so isolated, it's difficult to have that. And a lot of people don't really understand that, which I'm kind of glad in a way, because that means they haven't maybe faced that. But it's difficult to grasp the thought that, before a certain age, it's like you didn't exist. You have memories, but there's no one to talk about those with or to connect to around those things. And so it takes a lot of strength to move on, from that and to build new roots in a new life. So how did things progress then as you went into, you kind of foreshadowed your teenage years a little bit already, but how did things progress as you went into your teenage years? Did you get baptized young, being in such a controlling family, or?
Oh yeah, I got baptized when I was 12. And I did it for all the wrong reasons, obviously, like anybody who's 12 years old who gets baptized does. I wasn't necessarily facing pressure from my family. I think they didn't want me to get baptized so young, but I wanted more responsibilities in the congregation. I wanted to be able to pioneer because, like I said, that was my escape. And I wanted, friends. At the time, there were people in the congregation who were my age. We moved around quite a bit. So we moved to this congregation where there were people my age, but they were like elders' kids. And the elders' kids were only allowed to hang out with people who were baptized. So, of course, I did my little study and I gave them all the answers they wanted. And I got baptized. And, I should never have been forced to make that life-altering decision at such a young age in order to be accepted by my peers.
Yeah. You signed yourself up in a forever contract with the cult.
Yeah.
What else were you going to do? We all knew it was expected, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way around it. And if you didn't get baptized by a certain age, you started to kind of age out of, people would start to look at you a certain way, especially if you were around like 16, 17, 18. They know that if you become a legal adult and you leave, chances are they lose the option of controlling you. So if they can get you nailed down somewhere before 18, they've got their hooks in, and it's difficult to leave without facing extreme shunning and things like that. So you get baptized. Did you just immediately kind of jump into like auxiliary pioneering in the summers, or because I guess at that time you were being homeschooled, did you regular pioneer, or how'd you work it out?
Well, let's use the term homeschooling very loosely.
Oh, I understand.
It
I
was
know
more
what
like what they call unschooling now. We had some workbooks that they would give us, and we were just required to do them on our own. My parents didn't give us much education. They actually counted time that I went out in service and time that I spent reading the Bible as my education. So they would mark those down as hours that I spent, on school. So yeah, pretty much because I was homeschooled and I had all this free time, I went directly into auxiliary pioneering. I was getting the auxiliary pioneer hours, but of course I was too young to be an auxiliary pioneer. But I did spend an awful lot of time in field service.
Did you say you were too young to be an auxiliary pioneer?
Yeah,
You're baptized though, right?
yeah, I was baptized, but they said that I was too young. They wouldn't let me be an auxiliary pioneer. I was like 14, I think, by the time I was actually given like the title of auxiliary pioneer. I was still allowed to go out in service, but I don't know if that was just a weird quirk in my congregation that they just didn't want to do that. But
I wonder if they just didn't do that because they know it looks bad to have a child auxiliary pioneering and not going to school.
yeah, that's definitely a thing. Where we lived in South Georgia, there were like truancy laws and stuff, and like you could actually get, like, you could go to jail or get fined if your kids weren't in school during school hours. So that was before the homeschool movement became so popular. But yeah.
Yeah, so homeschooling was like it is for a lot of homeschoolers, like you said, the unschool thing, because education is just not valued at all inside the organization. It's just a means to an end. Why rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic and all the things they would say about investing in this life.
And I always found it very hypocritical because both of my parents are like advanced degree holders. My dad had 2 master's degrees, and my mom was an RN working on her master's degree. At the time, she eventually got her PhD before she died. And I always felt like that was super hypocritical of them. They could get their education and they could have a nice, comfortable life. But when it came to me, especially me, because I'm a girl, college was definitely frowned upon. Yeah, if anything, get your high school diploma, get a trade, but don't go to college.
Yeah. Yeah, you just mentioned the obvious that you're a girl. But what I wanted to say is about the fact that you said earlier, it stuck in my head. You said you wanted to get baptized because you wanted to like have privileges in the congregation or whatever. And really pioneering is all you could do because you're female. And so you can't, not that they're grand privileges anyway, but run the mics at the Kingdom Hall out to people, or, count the magazines and distribute literature or do any of those things. So really pioneering was it.
Yeah.
You had one course.
And I really did, in a better world, I really did want to do all those other things that I saw the brothers doing. I've always wanted responsibilities and to be part of something and to, be part of the gears that make everything work. To this day, I still do that. I still participate in life like that. But I always felt it was really unfair that I couldn't do the things that men were able to do in the congregation.
Oh yeah, it's a bad situation. And what are you going to do? Marry an elder or something? And then that's just getting your identity from your husband, because you're an elder's wife, as they would say in the congregation. So it's a real sad scenario where sisters in the congregation aren't encouraged to have really any identity at all.
And speaking of that, you're encouraged to want to marry. Yeah, you're encouraged to want to marry a Bethelite or an elder or something. Because you don't have an identity unless you're paired up with somebody, who's quote unquote important, but that leads a lot of girls, including me, to seek partners very young in life.
Oh.
I actually had a boyfriend. I met him in an AOL chat room. He was long distance, but I met him when I was 13 and we dated until I was 17. Because, you're just, as much as they want to say to not get married and to not have children or whatever, there's like a social stigma. There's like a social push toward getting married at a young age. And, I was on that path to getting married as soon as I turned 18, and I'm glad that that didn't happen.
Yeah, I was say I don't know how it is in Georgia, but I know in Kentucky and Indiana, married at 18. I mean, I've known people married younger than 18,
Me
whose
too.
parents signed and things like that, and happens all the time. The push to get married, the push to, and I think some of that push you mentioned as we talked about the identity issue. Even then, so the sister's identity is going to be wrapped up in I'm an elder's wife or whatever, but the brother's identity is just wrapped up in I'm an elder. Like nobody has their own true identity. It all is as relates to the cult.
Yeah.
And so nobody really knows who they are. And if you get married young, then they don't have to worry about you. They hope to not have to worry about you expressing your sexual urges in any way that would get you disfellowshipped and shunned from the congregation. So it's all about control all the way through. Did the control get worse for you when you started homeschooling because your parents now have you like in an even tinier box? Because all abuse is about isolating, and then oftentimes it gets worse as you get more isolated. Did it improve or get worse when you started? Because you can't get in trouble. You're not at regular school anymore, right? Or did they just get irritated because you couldn't live up to what they wanted there?
It was a lot of irritation of not being able to live up to their expectations. The control did get worse. It was to the point where I think my parents were afraid that somebody would see us outside of school, so we couldn't leave the house. Like we couldn't play outside. We couldn't talk to neighbor kids. The only place we were allowed to go was the library, and that was because we had to sit in silence, So the library in our home is what we were confined to, and that was pretty controlling and kind of awful.
Yeah, it's super sad. You're a kid. You should be outside playing and having a childhood, which a lot of us on various levels were not allowed to have, depending. And that's a shame. Really feel for you and your brother being so isolated. I am glad that you had each other, but like you said, even you all fought at times. That makes sense too. Kids fight, but also being in the middle of all this stress and turmoil, that's not going to make it easy on anybody. Well, you mentioned that your parents at some point couldn't quite control you as much. So how did things go as you progressed through your teenage years?
I was extremely rebellious. As the abuse got worse, I started to fight back. I was like, this isn't right. Like, I want you to stop doing this. And I did whatever I could, physically fight back or whatever it was. So they were starting to realize that they couldn't control me as much. And then I met this other brother, and we had a pretty intense relationship, as you do when you're teenagers, all those hormones raging and whatnot. And we made plans to escape, and we were going to get married, and we were going to get out of there. And eventually, because I was such a pain in the ass to my parents, they told me that as soon as I graduated high school, I could leave. So that was my plan. That's how I rebelled, is I studied a lot, and it was a correspondence high school. So it wasn't, like a real high school. So I graduated when I was 15. And then they took it back. Then they were like, no, you're too young. You can't leave till you're 18. And I was like, but you said, and that's when things really started going south for me. I started to act out. I started to try to make friends with worldly people. And the thing that really pushed it over the edge was I finally found some independence. Because I had graduated from high school so early, I was able to take a certified nursing assistant course. So I got a job. And that was my first exposure to worldly people. And my first, ability to make friends outside of the church. And it was super eye opening.
How
And
old
they
were
did
you
not like
then?
that at all. 15. I was 15.
You're 15 when you got your CNA?
Yes.
Whoa.
Yeah. I mean, I was extremely motivated to get out. So I was doing everything possible. They told me once I graduated high school, I could leave. Then they were like, once you get a job and you can support yourself, you can leave. So I said, okay. I checked off all those boxes and they still did not let me leave.
I can only imagine how much of a little workaholic they created because, I mean, first of all, you want to escape the organization. You want to escape being around your parents. So you're going to want to work anyway, right? It's probably better for you to work than to be home.
Yeah.
I know that happened to a lot of us, myself included. And then incentivizing you as well with saying, if you can support yourself, you can get out of this. That's got to be a lot of incentive to just hustle and grind and get yourself out of that situation.
Yeah, I wanted to get away from the abuse. The funny thing is that I didn't want to get out of the organization yet. I hadn't woken up yet. I was a true believer. Like, I really believed in God. I really believed that this was the truth. I really believed what I was telling people when I was out in field service. I really believed that my mission in life was to be a pioneer or to be a missionary or something. And that wasn't even like me looking for a sense of identity or whatever. That was a genuine belief that I had. So, I mean, I didn't start to wake up until a couple of years later.
So how did it go as a 15-year-old who's been boxed in and pent up for a long time and isolated, going into the wide world, in the job market, essentially? How did that go for you? I mean, it's got to be quite a culture shock.
It was definitely different. I got my first job at a nursing home there in Oregon where we lived at the time. And I went in so defensive. I thought for sure these people were going to, I was shoring myself up. I knew that I was going to have to protect myself from all these worldly influences and it was going to be terrible. But I got there and everybody was super nice and nobody talked about religion. And it was just about getting to take care of these wonderful old people and getting to hear their stories and lives. And it started to crack the shell, I guess. It was a long process. It took me probably about a year of working there before I really started to let people in and become real friends with them. But to say it was a shock is an understatement. Just a shock that the world was not as bad as I was led to think it was.
Yeah, it's kind of one of the first times sometimes you realize you've been lied to.
Yes.
That people on the outside aren't all murderers and rapists and thieves and whatever. Obviously, there are bad people in the world. There are bad people inside Jehovah's Witnesses as well. Bad people can exist anywhere, or unhealthy people who do really bad things to people. But most people that you're going to meet, they're just trying to get by in life and they're not trying to hurt anybody. And so that's cool that you got to see that. That was a big moment for us as well when we woke up, though we were much older than you at the time. And just realizing that the people that we were around, honestly, they felt like better people at times than the people I was around at the Kingdom Hall.
Yeah, more genuine for sure. There were less layers to get through. You could just tell that this is just who they are. They just put it out there. But I do have to admit that at the same time, while I was kind of waking up a little bit and learning that worldly people weren't all that bad, I did have that ulterior motive still of trying to bring them into the truth. You're supposed to be an example, and pretty much any worldly friend you make, that's always your motive underlying, is to bring them in, get a Bible study, show them that Jehovah's Witnesses aren't that weird and that we're good people and it's a good organization, etc. Be good examples. So I held on to that because like I said, I was a true believer at that time, and I held on to that belief and made those actions, for several more years.
So did you get to move out on your own?
Well, we moved from Oregon to a place in Northern California where I ended up moving out. I was 16 when we moved to Northern California. Um, and that's really when things kind of started to go south as far as me becoming waking up, so to speak. I ended up moving out when I was 17 and a half because in California, that was the legal age that they couldn't come take you back. Because the abuse had just escalated and the abuse escalated when my dad figured out he couldn't control me as much anymore because I did have a job. I was working full time. I was making my own money. I had my own car. I was able to just go and do as I pleased, and what's he going to do? Ground me or beat me? I didn't care anymore. So the control he just doubled down on that. And so the abuse got worse and I left when I was 17. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you got to get out then and that it didn't escalate even further, hopefully, after you left. I don't know your story, so I don't know where this goes. I hope you didn't. Did you, once you left, did that stop the cycle of abuse, or did he come after you wherever you went?
No, that was it. I wasn't in the home. I wasn't in a place where he could access me. I would see him at the meetings because I still went to meetings. I went to meetings until I was like 18 and a half, 19 years old. But he didn't have access to me to do that. And my life just got immeasurably better. I lived with a friend for a few months and then I got my own apartment as soon as I turned 18. And so I've been on my own ever since. Just for a number of years, it was in pure survival mode because I had lost at this point. So I stopped going to meetings when I was, like I said, 18, 19.
What made you stop?
Well, we'll back up a little bit. So I was seeing this brother, and when we were 16, we got caught in engaging in sexual behavior, which we didn't even have sex or anything. It was just so silly. We made out and how seriously they take stuff like that.
Oh, so yeah, you hold hands and they think you're.
Oh my God. It was like I had committed the worst sin in the world. It was the sky was falling. And so one Sunday after the meeting, I got pulled into a judicial meeting. And this is really when everything crumbled because I was sitting there with three elders and they were asking me the most embarrassing, personal, graphic questions that to me were just so violating. I left feeling dirty. I left feeling violated. I left that meeting thinking, this is not God's plan. Those men were not directed by God. This cannot possibly be right. I expressed regret for what I did, and I was privately reproved. And so even though this was my first taste of shunning, even though I was privately reproved, somehow everybody knew, and all of a sudden nobody would talk to me. And this went on for about 6 months until I was finally reinstated. But yeah, that tiny taste of shunning, that tiny taste of, wow, this can't be God's will. This can't be, this is not God's organization if this is the way they're going to operate. It started to make me question a lot of my beliefs. And even if I still believed in God at the time, but I believed that this wasn't his organization anymore.
You mentioned the judicial committee process and just how violating it is. At 16, they may have been asking questions, especially coming from an isolated environment. They may have been asking questions you didn't really know what they were even talking, because I know that's happened to other people I've talked to before, where they were asked questions and almost implicated themselves in things, or did, because they didn't even understand what they were being asked.
Oh yeah. I wasn't sexually experienced or anything. I had no idea what some of the terms even were that they were using. So I felt, a little trapped by that. I was I was deer in the headlights the entire time I was in that meeting, and it exposed me to some things that I wouldn't have even normally been exposed to had I not been in that meeting.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's intimidating. Just for the audience, you're picturing a 16-year-old girl sitting in front of three men who are asking alone in a room, asking these kinds of questions. It's really messed up.
And I call it what it is. It's sexual abuse. I felt
Yeah.
abused. There's never an appropriate situation where a minor child should be in a room with a bunch of adults asking or answering sexual related questions, unless you're, maybe a cop or something. But this wasn't like that. This is their own separate judicial committee. And I think that's one thing that people who were never in the Jehovah's Witnesses don't understand, is that they had, their own court system basically to deal with abusers and whatnot. And the cops were never involved in any situations like this. So even, minor infractions like me making out with a boy when I was 16 were handled the same way as, a pedophile would be handled, or, my dad would be handled if, I had told them that I was being abused. Never were the police involved in anything. It was just three elders in a room.
Yeah, they keep everything in house, as much as possible, because it's all about keeping up appearances and making the organization appear clean so that nobody knows what really goes on. You also mentioned it was private reproof, supposedly, and then of course everybody finds out about it, which is just another example of, it's the way Jehovah's Witnesses are. There's always the gossip line or the backbiting. People, they don't have anything else to do. So something like that's big news. It's the best thing to happen, is just that there's some drama or something that you can find out, because nothing else is happening ever in your life.
Yep.
And so I'm not surprised that happened. I'm a little surprised they shunned you quite like that, but I shouldn't be, because that's just who they are. It's what they do. Again, it's in their DNA.
Yep.
Happens all the time to people. Plus, you didn't have any friends your age, really.
I had like one friend my age in that congregation. Yeah.
Was she told to stay away from you too?
Yes, she was told to stay away from me. Her dad was an elder, so, she knew. And I think everybody else, if they didn't know, they figured it out by the fact that I was no longer allowed to go in field service and do the things that I had been extremely active in doing. I was an auxiliary pioneer still at that time. I had a full-time job and was auxiliary pioneering, which I can't remember. I think that was 60 hours a month back then. I don't know what it is now, but so they figured out that, I wasn't doing the field service anymore. So there must be something wrong with me. So they just all stopped talking to me and inviting me to things. And it was pretty rough.
Yeah. And
that's a rough thing for a 16-year-old to go through, It's different when it's a rough thing for an adult, but, when you're 16 and your whole worldview is, you have to be accepted by your peers and you need to have friends and whatever, your personality is still growing. Your brain's still growing. That's a pretty traumatic thing to happen to a 16-year-old.
Oh yeah, it's terrible. Did your parents treat you differently?
A little, but
imagine.
They were extremely disappointed in my actions, and I think they blamed themselves a lot for allowing the space for that to even happen. Even allowing me to have a boyfriend. That was actually a pretty scandalous thing for a lot of people. Back then, I had a boyfriend from the time I was 13 to the time I was 17. So
it was known at 13 that you had a boyfriend?
Oh yeah.
Oh wow, that is scandalous.
But my parents didn't think anything of it because it was long distance, but we did meet up several times a year. As our relationship progressed, we would see each other very often, like every month or two. So it was a kind of scandalous thing. I think everybody expected me to be the one who got married at 16.
Understood. I caught myself. I noticed that when you said you had a friend in the Kingdom Hall, I said something about she, because of course it has to be a girl. you can't have a friend who's of the opposite sex in the congregation. A lot of times, the first time that you ever talk to anyone of the opposite sex on some level at times is when you're dating someone with the view to marriage from the time you start dating. It's just a real messed up world where you're not allowed to hang out with other people in any kind of normal way. So, all right. So now you're out of the house, you're on your own, and you said that things had started to go a certain way, and you led to you waking up. We talked about the judicial committee. What else kind of helped you as you were going down that path?
I did, not to sound cliche, but I did read Crisis of Conscience, which is like, everybody's required reading for when they're exiting the cult. I read that, and I started to go on like online message boards. The internet was not what it was back in 2001 when I was leaving. So there were not very many resources, and even I just still remember how terrified I felt just looking up, just entering the search words into my computer to learn about ex-JW stuff, or to learn about, deeply learn about the organization. I was reading apostate material, and I knew that God could see me, and I knew that the elders would find out somehow, and that I would be disfellowshipped. To this day, just thinking about that is just so shocking to me, that I was that controlled, that brainwashed to think that literally Jesus was looking over my shoulder and would tell somebody. And that's a hard thing to explain to people who weren't in it, that mystical thinking, magical thinking was just so commonplace. It's ridiculous to look back on it now. Like, of course nobody was watching over my shoulder.
Yeah, but you were how old were you at that time? Like 18-ish?
17, 18, yeah.
I was 30. See, that's when I was 38. So I was probably like 36, 37. The same place you were, and asking my wife, like, can I go look at this? Because I know if I do, like, I can't, once I open this door, I can't close it. And then just to go on a forum and realize that, oh, these people just see the exact same thing that I see. I'm not crazy after all, but it's just like any abusive situation. They've got you so twisted up inside and so afraid. There's so much fear around everything on the outside that you're just afraid to look at it. You don't know what you don't know. And then they convince you that the second you do, lightning won't strike you, but somehow the Holy Spirit will let the elders know, and your dirty secret is out, and your whole life is over.
Yep. You know? Yeah. So that's kind of what started, or what helped, was reading that book, and then going on the forums, and just reading other people's experiences and why they left. I still continued to go. I think I was 20 by the time I stopped going. I would still try to go to the meetings. And the funny thing is, I remember back when I was a teenager, I would get in my car and I would try to go to the meetings. I was living on my own at this time, and I would drive to the parking lot, and I would just keep driving. Like there was a little voice in my head that said, don't go into that building. Don't do it. You don't need to do this anymore. And so I would just go for drives, 2-hour drives on a Sunday morning, because I was just so anxious and fearful of going into that place. And that's really when I knew that this was not for me, that this was over. And I stopped going.
Can you describe that? Because that same thing happened to me too. I would drive into the Kingdom Hall parking lot, turn around and drive out because I couldn't get out of the car.
Yeah.
I know what it was like for me. What was that relief like when you passed the Kingdom Hall or whatever and just drove?
It was so nice. It was so nice. I would just pop in whatever satanic music my parents hated and just go for these 2-hour long drives and just contemplate and think and be super grateful that I wasn't in that meeting, and go home and just breathe a sigh of relief, literally. Get out of my Kingdom Hall clothes and just be a normal person for a Sunday. It was a relief for sure.
It's a beautiful thing to when you see that freedom, that you start recognizing the relief that you're getting. And it took me a long time to realize that, because they always teach you to blame yourself. Mm-hmm. I thought it was me. I thought I had severe social anxiety. It wasn't.
Same.
And I did have social anxiety because they made me terrified of everyone outside of Jehovah's Witnesses. But I was even afraid to go into the Kingdom Hall, and it was just my body letting me know, like, this isn't for you. You don't belong here.
Yeah.
And literally forcing me away from this place. And I couldn't wait to get out of my suit and watch some football on a Sunday, or my wife and I go out and do something or whatever. It was just the best feeling in the world. So I understand.
It makes me sad to think about all the years that I gave to the cult. All those Sunday mornings that I could have just been spending drinking coffee and reading the paper or reading a book or doing something that fulfills me, not that fulfills some organization. Now I cherish that time because I know what it's like to have it snatched from you. So yeah, like any chance I get to just sit back and relax. And I sometimes I think back, like, I wish I'd be at the meetings right now. Like, it's still 20 years later. I still think that way sometimes, but yeah, such a relief to not have to do that for an organization anymore.
Yeah. So many missed out opportunities just as a kid, watch Saturday morning cartoons or, things like that. I got to till I was 8 and my parents became witnesses. So I had it and then it was taken away because then we had to go knock on doors on Saturday mornings and go out with strangers and do these weird things. And so, yeah, I understand both sides of that. And there's just so much more freedom to grow up in a life where your Saturday mornings or Sundays are your own to some degree, or the things we could have gotten involved in, activities or friends or sports or anything.
I don't have children, but I can't imagine if I did. I can't imagine putting them through that life. Like, kids deserve a chance to be children. And we didn't get that opportunity.
Yeah, so. And your parents, and that's one of the things that irritated me about my parents as well. My parents came in later in life into the organization. They got to have normal childhoods. Mm-hmm. I mean, normal. They had abuse in their families. I'm not saying that things were great just because they weren't witnesses. That's not true. I get that. But they had some options, and they never had to go through the stuff that you or I or others had to go through, just going to school every day, not standing for the Pledge of Allegiance or whatever. Like, that was a daily, every day was a battle. There was something going on. And they never had to do any of that as kids. So it's really, for lack of a better term, kind of bullshit the expectations they put on their kids, and then the way they treat their kids for not following through when they never had to do that as kids themselves.
I feel like it affects me to this day in that, like, so I never learned how to play when I was a kid. Kids should play. And everything was always so serious all the time. Any free time you had, you were reading, my book of Bible stories, or you were reading the Bible or the daily scriptures or whatever, or studying for a meeting. So, like, there was no time to play, even if we were encouraged or allowed to do that. And to this day, I don't know how to play to this day, I think, even as an adult. Very rigid sometimes, and always have to be occupied doing something. I always have to be producing something or reading or studying or doing, and I learned that from the time I was a toddler,
I get it. Same here. I had to work through that. And it's something that when I coach people, we often have to work on, because people feel like they have to be on and be productive at all times, which simply isn't the case. And
you have to in the cult in order to be a valued person. Like, in order to be of value to them, you have to be producing something for them.
Right.
So,
and there's a lot of hypervigilance that comes along with it too, always paying attention and like monitoring everything that you're doing. Is it enough? Is this productive? Whatever. And then hating on yourself for the times that you're not always on and productive and somehow pushing forward or whatever.
And that's been really difficult. I mean, I know for me during the pandemic that we're unfortunately all experiencing right now, there are less opportunities to be productive and to do that. So it's forced a lot of self-reflection and forced relaxation and forced playtime, I guess. So
Absolutely. Book recommendation for anyone listening: Power of Vulnerability by Brene Brown. And in it, she studies shame, vulnerability. And I often give this book to people I work with because in it, she talks about a group of people she called the wholehearted. And one of the lessons in the book is that the people who seem to be the happiest are the people who find play in their lives and have made time for that and understand that. And so that's something that, so just, you're not alone. It's something that people in general can deal with a lot of times. But for all the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and other groups that I work with, play is difficult to come by because everything was deadly serious for our entire lives. Every action, every thought, every feeling could lead us astray. And so we were just never allowed to truly be free. And there's true freedom to be found in being able to be vulnerable and be able to have that playtime for yourself or with others, whatever the case may be. It really is freeing. So great book if anybody is interested in it. And I understand how you would have struggles in that area.
The only time, well, the first time I was able to let myself be free that way and play, this is going to sound really cliche, but I went to Burning Man. And that is just an adult, well, it's for kids. Kids are there too, but it's just a big playground, literally a playground where you don't have any worries. Everything is free. Everything is easy. You know, there's art you can climb on. It's like going to a big jungle gym and you're surrounded by a whole bunch of other people who are, you know, seeking the same thing as you. And that was like one of the most freeing moments of my life, realizing that I'm 30 and I can go out and I can play. And so that has taken, you know, a bigger focus in my life since I've been to Burning Man, actually. I still struggle with it, but, you know, now I can sit back and play a video game and not feel guilty about it, or, you know, something like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Wow, you really went in deep. You went from I can't play to Burning Man.
Yeah,
Hey, it takes something like that to set you free too, you know, in some ways. Mm-hmm. And that was at 30 and you left at 20, right?
Yeah.
So it does take time, and we have to forgive ourselves for taking that time. We're products of the environment we came from, and it takes us some time to learn new skills and things that we should have been taught as children, but we weren't given that opportunity.
It took me a long time to get out of survival mode, is kind of what I call it. Because when I left, you know, you leave all your support system, your roots are cut off, like you said, and you've got to figure this stuff out on your own, and you've got to figure it out really fast. And you don't have a fallback. I couldn't move back in with my parents. I couldn't, you know, call a friend for help or whatever. So I was just in survival mode, you know, financially and in every other way for a number of years, probably until I was about 28. Until I had finally like graduated college and gotten some financial stability and had built a little circle of friends around me. And then I finally like breathed out. I could breathe easy. And then I was able to like attack like parts of the things, the damage that the cult had done. Start going to therapy. That helped a lot. And then trying to address the things like not being able to have fun, you know, not being able to play. When I finally found some stability. So that's something that I wish people understood about coming out of the Jehovah's Witness cult, is that you work for a really long time to find stability and meet your lower level needs so that you can meet your higher needs, you know.
It's a Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah, I think people take that for granted a lot of the times.
Oh yeah, you have to be able to survive before you can thrive. You know, you get your survival under wraps, then you can start working on these other things. So for you, how did you end up leaving? How did you get out? So I think we left off at around 18-ish. I think you said you left around 20. So how did things go? How did it end up for you?
Well, at this point, I wasn't dating that Jehovah's Witness anymore. I had met somebody else who would later become my husband. I met him when I was 17, and he helped me a lot to realize that the church was a cult. I attempted to do a fade. I attempted to just fade out and to not get disfellowshipped or anything. And I worked really hard to not let anybody know anything wrong that I did. I was living such a double life, and it was so stressful. I was hiding my boyfriend. I was hiding the fact that I was going out. I wouldn't even go out in my town. I would drive 90 minutes away to Reno, so that I could go and do anything with my boyfriend and not get caught, So that was extremely stressful for a few years. And then finally, when I was 20, everything kind of came crashing down. My parents found out about my boyfriend, and they were going to turn me into the elders, and if I didn't break up with him and start going back to meetings. And I was like, fine, do it. And so they told the elders. The elders were basically like, she's not doing anything wrong. We can't prove that she's doing anything wrong right now. She's going to have to come and confess anything that she's done if we're to do anything about it. So a year or so went by. I was 21 and I got married. I got married in my ex-husband's church, actually. My parents obviously weren't there. And about a month after my honeymoon, the elders started to hound me. They were stalking me. They would come to my house at all hours of the day. They would call my work. They would call me repeatedly. And I would just try to dodge them. I would just ignore them. I would hide when they knocked on the door, etc. And eventually I just got so fed up with their constant stalking and harassment that I picked up the phone one day and I said, leave me the F alone. I literally said that. I said, I don't want to talk to you ever again. I want you out of my life. And they're like, well, does this mean we take this to mean that you're disassociating yourself? And I said, you can take that to mean whatever you want. And I hung up on them. And then the next Thursday I was disassociated. So I never even got to write a letter or anything. They just took that call as my wanting to leave. And that was it.
Gotta say, you never got to write a letter, but I kind of like the way you went out.
It was like a total mic drop. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I wrote the letter, but I kind of like how you got to do it there as well. So how did it feel having your parents turn you in?
Oh, that was the ultimate betrayal. I couldn't believe that they would do that. And our relationship was already pretty damaged from growing up in such an abusive, house. But that was pretty much it for me. I was done with my parents at that point. I said, this is not love. This is not real parenting. Yeah, I was done.
Yeah, I understand.
And that got harder, and that did change over the years. I was very angry at that time. And I was angry when I got disassociated. So I didn't care about talking to my parents or care about talking to any of those people. I said, if they were going to treat me like this, they're not my friends. I don't want them in my life anyway. And that carried on for a few years. But then eventually, I did start to miss having a relationship with my parents. It's not a normal thing to be in your early 20s and to not speak to your parents. And I was going through a lot of things. I was getting married. I bought a house. I graduated from college. And these are all things you want your parents to be involved in your life. And, my parents weren't part of any of that. I did try multiple times to kind of rekindle a relationship with them and try to get them to see that maybe this isn't the truth and that they should have a relationship with their children. But that ultimately failed every time. They weren't interested. Every time they had an ulterior motive every time they talked to me, and that was to try to get me back into the truth. And eventually I figured, that's all they wanted. So I just kind of cut them off. I stopped, taking their phone calls, which they would call me about once a year around the memorial time, try to get me to come to the memorial. And yeah.
It's emblematic of the type of love that Jehovah's Witnesses have. It's control. It's not love. Control is not love. And that is what Jehovah's Witnesses have typically. Not to say there's no love there, but it's very controlling. That's what it's about. Are you doing what they want you to do? If you are, then hey, we love you. As soon as you choose any other path other than this one very narrow-minded path that they've chosen in life, then you're done to them and you're dead to them. And it's a hard thing to come to terms with. It's a hard thing to accept about our lives.
I don't think they know what love, like they, coming from the outside, it's easy to look inside and say, you don't know what love is. And that makes me really sad for them. I used to be very angry, but now I pity them a little bit, because I know that it could get better for them if they just left.
Yeah, they're cult victims.
For me.
Yeah, they're victims here. They're cult victims on some level. Or, talking about your parents, there's likely stuff in their past that, maybe it's coming out in the abuse that they inflicted upon their own children or whatever, but they've probably been through some things. They had some vulnerabilities that were exploited that led them to escape into the doctrines of Jehovah's Witnesses instead of getting real help for maybe whatever issues they had. Oftentimes that's the case. They're just people too. And unfortunately, though, they've stayed stuck in an environment where every day is the same, nothing really changes, while you have been able to go out and grow and experience life. And it is sad to see that for our parents, but ultimately we got to take care of ourselves, and that's all we can do. So it sounds like you kind of did get involved in life. So after you disassociated, or were disassociated, or whatever, however you want to phrase it, it sounds like, so you got married, got a house, started having this life. How did that go for you? How did it feel to have a life outside the organization?
It was a struggle for a long time. I felt like an outsider in my husband's family because they were extremely religious, and they still looked at me like that Jehovah's Witness girl. They were very suspicious of me. They didn't want their son to have anything to do with me. And it was still, trying to find my place in the world, quote unquote, the world. Cause I was fresh out. I still had things that were beliefs that were tied to the Jehovah's Witnesses, even though I was done with the organization and I knew it was all bullshit. It's just something, when you're brainwashed and indoctrinated so much, it takes years to unlearn stuff. And it made my life very difficult.
Absolutely. I just wanted to hit that point you mentioned about feeling like an outsider in your husband's family. No matter how much other people try to accept you, if because of where you come from, you felt like an outsider. It doesn't matter how accepting even those people might try to be. Oftentimes we're projecting onto them, reading into looks, reading into whatever they do, because we just feel so different, because we were raised so different. And it's a tough place to be, very alone.
I eventually was able to, and I still didn't have very many friends because I lived in a rural town and I didn't have anybody that I had anything in common with. So still didn't have very many friends as a young adult. And then I went to college. I went to nursing school in Southern California, where I met some amazing people who were great friends. And that kind of, helped me feel a little bit less alone in the world. And just like I had a place in it, this was my purpose. This was my place. These are my people. I finally had that when I was about 24, 25. So, the first few years were rough, but, it got better. It always gets better. And it just takes time. And I thought for sure it would never get better. But I'm here. I'm sitting here now, and, 20 years later, almost, a completely changed person, a completely different person, somebody that I never thought I would have the opportunity to be.
So what's that look like? I know that you've done a lot of things since you've left, I know one thing in Reno that I've seen the pictures of, but what have you gotten involved in your life since leaving that you really have found purpose in, or just enjoyment in? What has your life, what was the trajectory of your life after leaving that now that you can have these things?
Well, I mean, I wanted to bring up something that in the previous podcast, Jennifer, I believe was her name, she mentioned volunteering. And that's what kind of got me on my path to doing all of the things that I do. Is I just decided one day that I was going to say yes to everything and volunteer for a bunch of stuff until I found my place in the world. And so I started running bar crawls, and I started, working with foster kids, and that wasn't the right thing. And eventually I landed on the Reno music scene and the Burning Man art scene. And I just showed up to the generator one day and started pushing a broom. The generator is an art space that I help run. It's a 24,000 square foot industrial art makerspace. And then I found this amazing group of people who were like, "You're cool, come on in. Like, we accept everybody. I'll teach you how to weld. I'll teach you how to cut glass." And that, led me to learning how to build sculptures. So I build public art as a hobby. So I have that. And then I also run a music podcast where we record live bands every week. And that led me to running a large music festival here in Reno. So just volunteering and just getting out there and opening yourself up to new experiences, and trusting people, trusting that you're not going to go into this place and everybody's going to, make fun of you and turn on you or shun you again. That was a real turning point in my life when I figured out that real people, regular people, don't shun people. That only the organization does that. And no matter what you do, you're not going to get kicked out of this, group that you're in because, you don't believe in a certain thing that they believe in anymore.
It's freeing, isn't it? And makes you feel a lot more secure and stable.
Yeah.
To have real friends or people who actually care about you.
It's hard too sometimes, though, to believe that people actually care about you because you grew up believing that just in any given second it could all be ripped away from you. You just had to make one mistake. And yeah, it is freeing and comforting, and it's been pretty awesome.
That's awesome. We all have abandonment issues to some degree, coming from that environment, or maybe we're just made to feel like we were never lovable or could not be lovable in any way. And so I'm glad you found that. Anything that you would like to shout out your podcast? What's your podcast? Might be somebody who'd be interested.
I run the Worst Little Podcast. It's at worstlittlepodcast.com, and we're also on Spotify. We have a new band on every week. Unfortunately, we're not doing live music right now because of COVID, but we are doing Zoom meetings. So we're recording all those and putting them up on Spotify. Different interview every week. Yeah, that's pretty much
really
it.
Cool.
Yeah, and if you're interested in music.
And I know, so you had something to do, right, with the Space Whale in Reno?
Yes, I was lead on a lot of some of the work that we did. I did a lot of the glass work.
I just, ever since I saw that, with you on Facebook, I just think that's the coolest thing. I love the Space Whale. I've never been to Reno, never been able to see it, but someday if I get out there, I want to see the Space Whale for sure, because that's awesome. That's really cool.
Yeah, thanks.
So is there anything today that you'd like to say to anyone that shuns you? Like, I don't know, how long has it been since you've seen or spoken with your family at all? Or
I haven't spoken to my father in probably 5 years, not even when my mom died last year. He didn't allow my brother and I to be part of that death experience because, reasons. But I mean, if I could say something to him, I would tell him that it's not too late, that he can change, he can leave. But part of me is also extremely angry, and I would tell him good riddance. So there's two. I would tell him, it may be too late for our relationship, but it's not too late for him to get out and live a normal life. And that goes for everybody in the cults. I want them to get out. I want them to see that what they believe is love is not love, and that there's a whole other way to live. And it's just as fulfilling. It's just as promising. and it's just bigger.
Can I say that that's actual love? I mean, there's nothing, obviously, on one hand, you have every right to your own feelings of hurt and anger, maybe even rage at times, whatever the case, against your father, and rightfully so. On the other hand, though, that's love. Like, you want him to be happy and have a chance, right? That's actual love. You know, Jehovah's Witnesses want us to go out, leave them, and fall on our face and just suck at life and be unhappy, because all they care about is they want us to be unhappy, so we hit bottom and come back to them. That's all they care about. They don't want us to leave and be happy.
Yeah.
And so you just want your dad to be happy, whatever the case is.
I want him to get, I want him to get better.
Yeah.
I want him to get better and then to get happy, because he's got a lot of work to do on himself. But, you know, the first step is leaving the cults. You got to make that big leap.
Yeah. Do you, I don't know if you want to say or not, your brother, is he still a witness, or?
He faded. He was able to leave because he literally just moved away, and I don't think they can find him. I think they're just giving up on him. So he can technically still talk to my family, and technically still go to the meetings and whatnot. But he's gone. I think he left when he was like 21, 22.
To the normal person out there who would listen to this, people, in order to leave the Witnesses and not get shunned and not lose everything, not have their family weaponized against them and things like that. A lot of times, when you're talking about fading, you just talked about your brother basically under the radar, moved or something in another place. I've known people to have burner phones and move across the United States and things like that to keep at least the lines of communication open with their families. That's not normal in any way. The first thing that came to my mind was the witness protection program.
Yeah.
and as I was thinking about it in my head just now, like that's so, it's so apt. It's the witness protection program. You're fading, you're running away, so that you can be protected from what they would do to you and your family if you allowed people to know who you really are. It's not a great way to live. I understand it. Still keeping you in some unhealthy patterns connected to these unhealthy people and unhealthy cults. But
I do have to say he's not connected to anybody anymore. Like he doesn't talk to our dad either. He would very gladly give up, send in a dissociation letter or whatever, if he needed to. But he's completely out in every sense of the word, and he hates them as much as I do.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. But it is interesting just to what lengths people have to go to leave a church, like it's to just not believe anymore.
It's insane.
Whatever.
And they're just, it baffles me that there was a time in my life that I thought that was normal.
Yeah. Well, now you get to have a new normal, the buzzword of the day, right? With COVID, yeah. The new normal. But what's your new normal? What do you enjoy about the life you have today? And is there anything that you hope for or want for your future?
Oh my God, just freedom. I'm just so grateful to have the freedom to do as I please, to relax on Sunday mornings instead of having to go to a meeting, to not have to study all the time and not have to give, freely of my time to this organization. And I guess just what I hope for the future is just more of the same. My life it's turned out extremely well, despite all the challenges, despite where I came from, despite all I've had to overcome. My life is just wonderful, and I'm surrounded by wonderful people. So I just hope to continue to do the things that I love, music and art and camaraderie and friendship with, people that I love.
Once you find happiness, what else is there, right?
I can't think of anything else.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And you deserve it. You know, everyone deserves it. But,
Yeah.
so many of us have been through so much and had to work so hard to get to a place where happiness is even a possibility.
Yeah.
Just trying to survive and grow. And good for you for doing that. I'm glad that you have this life now that you can be proud of, instead of one that isn't really a good fit, or that is keeping you isolated. And now you get to be you, right?
Yeah.
Figure out who you are. Yeah. All right. Well, is there anything you would like to say that I didn't ask you, or leave a parting shot? Anything you'd like to say to someone listening out there?
Well, I want to say that I appreciate the Facebook group for the Shunned podcast. That's helped me through some pretty tough times. And just seeing everybody else's experience and being able to be a support network for everybody else who's going through this it's a good thing. It's a positive thing that you're doing, and I appreciate it a lot. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad it's helped. I mean, that's why I spend the time I spend in there, and glad to have good people in there helping each other. It's a pretty cool place.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully anyone out there who's watching or listening, find the Shun Podcast Facebook group. It's a support group for people like us, and not just ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. We have people from other cults, other religions who've left and lost people who are trying to rebuild, and welcome anyone in there who wants to be a support or find some support. So that's what it's about. So thank you very much, Kim. I appreciate you being open about your life and everything you've been through, and wish you all the best. I just want everybody to be happy.
Thanks.